Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
I want to talk about a piece that was published in First Things Journal, but it began as a talk, the Erasmus Lecture. And this was given by a gentleman named Paul Kingsnorth, who I'm willing to bet will be a new name for some of you, but his star is kind of on the rise. He's a poet, he's a fiction writer, former atheist, turned pagan, and then converted to Christianity. Kind of got his real awakening began with environmental activism, I think, which started in his university career. But it was through his love of nature that he began to recognize that there was more to life than meets the eye. And he himself, as an atheist, would talk about mystical experiences that he had in the woods, and he could not account for them. Materialism simply was completely inept before some of these experiences. And so he began to move away from that. And paganism was a stepping stone for him. And eventually he became a Christian. And he's still a pretty young believer, something that he points out repeatedly. But this talk is quite provocative. It's been given the title Against Christian Civilization. And I think we're going to link it in the show notes. So it is very much, I'll just go ahead and say it's worth your time. You either can look it up and watch him deliver the lecture, or you can, if you prefer to see it in front of you, you can read it. We'll link to both the video for the lecture and to the article itself. This is an important article. And usually when people say that to me, my heckles go up, because there is no end of people trying to foist articles on you on a daily basis. But when I say I think it's important, I mean, I think this is an extremely well-written and provocative piece of Christian thinking about our moment. It's a challenging article, and I can pretty much guarantee you're going to come to places in it where you disagree, or you're going to squirm, or you're going to be annoyed, and that is also the mark of a good thought-provoking piece. So we'll highlight some elements of it, but all that to say, I think it's very much worth your time to read it. All right. What I want to begin with, I think probably a constructive place to begin would just be to look at one of the central theses of this article. And that is this. This is a provocative claim, so let's walk through it a little bit. But essentially, Paul Kingsnorth makes the argument that there is no way to have a Christian civilization in the full sense of Christianity. So one place in the article where he begins to explore this notion is he talks about after the fall. What happens after the fall? In the garden, he doesn't speak too much about what's, the state of things in the garden, but essentially, you can assume a type of, harmony. But after that, after the fall, he says, what do we get? We get farming, we get metallurgy, we get industry, we get killing, we get civilization. I want to pause there, because I think this is one of the places that I marked off in the talk and in the article where I think people who are perceptive readers, who are reading carefully, are going to stop and say, wait, okay, here's a powerful assumption. Civilization, according to Paul Kingsnorth in his reading here, is necessarily a byproduct of the fall. He's not the only one who said this, by the way. There are theologians who make cases very similar. But let's visit this for a little bit. Let's talk about that.
Yeah,
Nathan, I'd love to hear you weigh in on this point.
The question is, so let's back this up. And was the long-term intent for humans to be in the garden, or was the be fruitful and multiply mandate implicitly developmental, so to speak, in that way? So I think that would be one of the theological questions you want to be asking yourself is, are these things truly the byproduct of the fall? You have, they're put in a garden, they're given responsibility to work. So work is not a consequence of the fall. Perhaps even the agricultural pursuits, the caring, nurturing, gardening stuff isn't necessarily a result of the fall. So I think you can split the difference here and say that certainly um, the so running around the other way. What's the purpose of a civilization? Is to try to figure out how to organize ourselves in a way that we don't all kill each other. And I think in that sense, you could very much say civilization is a result of the fall. And he adds in there too of then because the impulse that happens then in civilization is the desire to be your own god and to build your own tower. Um, it's not incidental that Babel is part of that post fall um, train wreck that humans have created. So uh, I don't want to make it sound like there wouldn't have been a development of interactions between humans and nature had there not been the fall. I think God intended for that kind of growth to be there. And we ultimately do see, if you read to the end of the book, that I'm talking about a city whose architect is God is the way that this thing ends. So structure and order and development and growth and work and the structuring of human relationships and hierarchy in our relationship with God is not what we're talking about here when we're talking about civilization. We're talking about man constructed attempts to grapple with the brokenness that we experience in our own lives and our relationships with other people, relationship with God, and relationship with the planet. So civilization in response to that, um, I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here. Can
Yeah.
I make those? Can I make those distinguishing characteristics, or is that trying to have my cake and eat it too?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's a naughty question, and not naughty as in ill behaved, but as in we've got a Gordian knot before us here. Well, it depends, I suppose, on how we understand or define civilization. That's important, and he ties civilization to a very clear sense of conquest. So in the article, it's clear that Paul Kingsnorth would agree with everything you said. I think, Nathan, he's
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily opposed to organized forms of living or community or anything like that. But what he sees as civilization is life organized on a mass scale, and usually around the basis, as you mentioned, Nathan, of conquest, technological advancement. And what that involves usually is some form of conflict where one civilization displaces another. Plenty of people I talk to, Nathan, many of whom are professing Christians, would consider this just to be a point of stark realism. We've seen a number of articles making political arguments recently that have said something along those lines. Look, civilizational challenges happen. This is a tragic aspect of human experience, but we can't bury our heads in the sand and pretend that it doesn't exist. What I
Can
like about this, yes, please interject.
Well, so because I think what we want to be careful here is that very quickly people will say, well, Christianity is a dominion type of it's been used in Western culture as a conquesting, but okay, that's not unique to Christianity. We're talking about just because we used a biblical example to get started here does not mean that we're saying that all civilizational conquest is derived from biblical motivations. In fact, we're going to argue the opposite of that, I would imagine, by the time we get to the end of this. But secondly, if you go back and read like Henry David Thoreau, he thought that cultures by and large conquered by moving west, and he's not a Christian at all. Um,
Mm.
and so he was thinking, yes, the east coast of the United, like people came from Europe, they moved west to the eastern part of the United States. Then the superior culture will move west, conquering everything in its path until we get to California, and then it'll jump across the Pacific and will conquer Asia, and then it'll continue right around the world, growing. Like he had this idea of civilization continuing to advance by continuing to conquer the thing to its west. Like, I mean, I know that's a little bit of a weird,
Yeah.
but if you can think of like you're running laps around the earth and civilizations conquering each other and getting stronger as you go, um, that would fit more with this idea of civilization, I think, in a conquering motif. Anyway, there's a rabbit trail that goes around the world, but I'll stop.
So one more note on civilization, then we'll come back to that in a second. But what I like about this article, though, also is that he talks about, I mentioned the people who say I'm just a realist or I'm a tragic realist. I've kind of investigated that line of thinking in an article before as well. But what I like about this article is he's not concerned with being realist with necessarily being a realist or being practical. In fact, the article states explicitly at the end, Christianity is deeply impractical. Now, I think he's right about that from a certain standpoint. It's deeply impractical from the standpoint of moving along with the status quo. Christianity conflicts with just the way things are around here, human culture or just human life in general, because human life, it's part of a fallen human order. So we should expect that, and yet we don't often. But essentially, he wants to ask, what is the true spirit of Christianity? What is the right thing to pursue? So he also begins with a haunting picture of he's standing in an area where Native Americans had once lived, and he tries to put himself into that place and imagine what it would be like to have, he puts it pretty hauntingly, your inner and your outer world dismantled, your entire metaphysics, your whole view of the nature of reality taken away, which is what happened to Native Americans in North America. And then, of course, he's an equal opportunity offender. He goes on to point out that, of course, he's British himself, and his nation is engaged in this very kind of activity as well, displacing people. Of course, the British Empire was at one time one of the great massive empires of the world. So it's not an isolated incident. This is something that happens.
No, and in fact, he says everybody does this. It's the nature of reality. This is
yeah. So there's the realism piece. Yeah, there's the realism piece. But he tries to imagine, what would it be like to have, your entire world basically coming apart? And then he says that is somewhat what is happening to us right now in the West. An entire way of life is collapsing. And it's driving us to increasingly desperate measures. And one of those desperate measures, and he outlined some of the ways that you can, some of the responses from the Native Americans, for instance. There was die fighting. And he mentions, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, who have become legendary for, going down with their world, so to speak. Then there was the maybe, if you can't beat them, join them, sort of, assimilate. Then there's the sort of the naughtier or the more complex path of, maybe become a part of this new culture, but try to hold on to traces of your own culture and be kind of a diplomat or person negotiating those, holding on to those precious elements. So we see some of those iterations now, but this is where he fits one of those responses that he's looking at right now from those of us who recognize, hey, the West is really, it's been in decline for a while, but now it's really coming apart. It's falling apart. One of those responses is, one of the desperate measures is, he says, the Christian civilization piece. So we've talked about this here quite a few times before. Nathan, I will say, you've had distinct reservations about the Ion Hersiales. Tom Holland's not on record as being a Christian yet, but the Tom Hollands.
I've changed on Ion Hersiales. I think she's legit. Who am I to judge?
Yeah.
But I think maybe we could do I don't know, Jordan Peterson always gets picked on, but that category of respectful without believing, seen it as a necessity, the cultural good piece of it.
It's worth pointing out that this is not new either. So there are in other moments of great civilizational unrest in recent years, the Second World War, you had a number of people who were singing this song. And I think I've mentioned this before. You had, I think, one prominent example I like to point to is T.S. Eliot. Some people might object to that. Now, the reason I want to bring him up, and here's where I might differ a little bit from Paul Kingsnorth, and I'm with you, Nathan. I think Ion Hersiales sincere, and I think she's the real deal. But she's also a brand new Christian. So these are, for some people, this is a stepping stone. The civilizational piece is a stepping stone for some Christians. It clearly looks like it's shaping up to be that for Jordan Peterson as well, because he's certainly by all accounts seems to be getting closer and closer. So I wouldn't begrudge him that. But T.S. Eliot similarly recognized that, a hideous phrase, but a helpful one, that Christianity functions as really great social glue. And that was a beginning for him. Now, but at the end, of course, we get fortunately, T.S. Eliot was a poet, so we have a very articulate record of his inward spiritual journey. And the best place to look is his four quartets. So those are those are the words of a man he's been transformed by the renewal of his mind. But my point here is that what began as there, I think there was a civilizational stepping stone there. So the civilizational piece, in the end, I can put my cards on the table. I agree with Paul Kingsnorth that Christian civilization and capital, C and, both
Well,
capital C's, big Christian civilization writ large is not the answer here. We can
well,
talk
so
more about that in a second.
well,
But
can I just throw something in here that he points out, and I think Christians have for a long time recognized that when you pick up the New Testament and read it, it does not Jesus does not give us a political structure as far as like how to run a government or what's the ideal form of representative democracy, communism, whatever. Like it's a different kind of um it doesn't have that kind of partisan structured political
yep,
state rule.
yep.
Like the details just
Statecraft.
aren't
It's
there.
not statecraft.
It's not statecraft. And I think that's the beauty of it, is that it
Yep.
allows churches to flourish in any system that's going to come after Christ. Um, Obviously with persecutions and difficulties with Jesus foresaw and foretold. But I think that would be the interest. Like people who I think of Christian civilization speak as if the gospels do give us statecraft. And I think somebody
Yes.
like the author of this article coming from the outside in, it's just very helpful for somebody to be like, let's call a spade here and recognize this is not what this is talking about. Then, and let me just throw this in here to kind of egg you along here. Um, you get the same thing for the first couple hundred years of church history, that it wasn't even categorically possible or in the mindset of the church that they would ever have political power, structure, authority,
Yep.
anything. Like it was just such a far-fetched idea that it didn't even come up
Hmm.
as a possibility. So do that, then obviously you have some massive Roman syncretism.
Yeah.
Uh, we can the ins and outs of all that happened there. But then even when you get up to Luther, Luther and Calvin, but Luther in particular is deeply dismayed at the
Hmm.
chaos unleashed in the world by the Protestant Reformation, because he's recognizing that the Christianity is insufficient to run a country. And that was a big inner turmoil. I'm listening audiobook yesterday. I was actually just listening to Tom Holland and Dominion, this section on Luther's kind of massive inward conflict on saying, why did the Spirit of God not make it such that we don't need any governors? Like once everybody
Hmm.
has access to the truth, why do we still need civilization basically? Like why can't we all just get along if we're all Christians and all believe the same thing? Because that was one dumpster fire after another once everybody started interpreting scripture in their own way and own style and fashion. And so he had to come around to this idea of closer to a what we might in modern times call a two kingdom kind of element, where you need the civil represent like the civil structure of the state to operate and maintain laws and rule and order, because it's not there in the New Testament. And you need and he would say you need the Christian element of that to be the consciousness, so to speak, of that civil order. And so all I'm pointing out here is that what you're seeing in this article, and it's interesting, like you're saying, like this is one of the most viral things that's been written in First Things in a long time, actually is not new. It's very
Hmm.
new to a certain branch of theology. But I mean, even if you go back into even your radical Reformation, this idea of like there's nothing, you know, in the Bible that tells us how to run a society, that forbade their members from swearing oaths of allegiance to countries, that didn't run for political office, all as a continuous rejection of saying there's no such thing as a Christian hybrid
Hmm.
society. Um, and it sounds bad to say that because it sounds so anarchist.
Hmm.
So you basically have to come down to a structure of saying we're talking about two separate things here. We're talking about running and maintaining order and people driving the speed limits and not throwing their trash in their neighbors' yards. And then what people believe to be true about the value of humanity and their relationship with God and relationship with each other. that anytime that you try to force those things in the same category, you get an unhealthy alliance that probably in the long run is certainly always bad for the church and
Hmm.
sometimes not good for the state as well. So I just wanted to put the historical context to, like, when I read that article, I was like, good article. I think from my theological background, there wasn't anything new there. It was just interesting to see a fresh articulation of it.
Right. And I mean, again, and he's a young Christian, and he would point that out. And he's continually said, I'm not a theologian. So but as often happens now he's a very brilliant guy, great writer too. So he brings a certain set of skills along for the ride. But like a lot of young Christians, they often, when there's real powerful zeal there, they have a kind of a prophetic edge and freshness to their perspective. And that's the feel I get reading Paul Kingsnorth here. But just to so go back to civilization for a second, I want to offer what I think is a kind of rudimentary definition that will certainly not please everybody, but we need something. We need some working definition. Why don't we just say, for the sake of argument here, that civilization means society organized on a mass scale? Okay? Can we be somewhat happy with that?
Okay,
So,
fine.
society organized on a mass scale. Now we can see that building since the Renaissance, probably this has been happening, but this is very much aligned with the whole project of modernity. And again, modernity is a massively convoluted and hotly debated and contested word. It's almost as bad as postmodernism in terms of its lack of conceptual clarity, but I think it's still a necessary word. But certainly, a hallmark of modernity and the whole modern project is increasing levels of control. We want more control and we want more advancement. But I think another really important word. So I've said this in the past. I've talked about how it's really centered on kind of efficiency, human mechanisms of control. But another word that is really important that I've neglected in the past is the word progress. And that's spelled out in different ways. And there are different, but it's a highly important and practical word because it represents something that we just kind of default to. It's a default position for so many of us naturally. There's a helpful book that came out recently here by Patrick Deneen. He'd written he wrote Why Liberalism Failed, which kind of became an unlikely bestseller. Even, former President Barack Obama was a fan of the book. But now his new book is the kind of constructive proposal, and it's called Regime Change. That's a provocative title. Again, you're in for more of a work of intellectual history and good political philosophy. So just so you know, it's not like this firebrand book, which a lot of people were expecting. But he offers a really helpful overview of some of the modern iterations of progress. Classic liberalism, which would have been John Locke, would be the classic liberal, was really centered around material progress. I mean, John Locke, if you ever read John Locke, he's very concerned about ownership, property rights, and land ownership and that kind of thing. But then something momentous happens when you have John Stuart Mill. And John Stuart Mill is really the father of progressive liberalism, which is not so much centered on the, material progress. It's centered on something way more ambitious and I think more insidious. It's centered on human transformation. So if you remember the ending of C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, he's got that a book for our time, by the way. That's another thing you should just add to your reading list. It's short, packs a heck of a punch. You should read that. We should all be reading that one more. But at the end of it, he talks about how having conquered nature, the last frontier for us to conquer will be human nature. And that's John Stuart Mill. He talks about how we need to be radically free to conduct, this is his phrase, experiments of living. So he's the major individualist. He's the guy who thinks, he comes up with the principle of harm, where he begins to look at ethics, and he completely turns ethics on its head and says, well, we need to not be so worried about some deep law of right and wrong, some natural law or deep sense of justice. We need to just make sure that we're not hurting anybody. So long as we're living, conducting our experiment in living, and so long as we're not causing harm to anybody, we ought to be able to do and think and say whatever we please. So that notion of progress, we're continuing to
Yeah.
build more and
Well,
more and more and more and
okay.
grow more and more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. All right. You've made the point. But, and here's the big but on this is that so that again, I keep coming back to Thoreau here because I think he is the logical manifestation of that ideology of he's going to go
Mm.
experiment living by himself in the woods, not hurting anything or anybody, and is radical anti. He didn't even think there should be a post office and hated the idea of trains and thought the telegraph was a bad idea because why would anybody in Maine want to talk to anybody in Texas? Like it doesn't make any sense. All hyper local. You're living your own little experiment of self sufficient, and you're going to be governed by your moral inner nature and inner workings, and you don't need laws because everybody's going to respect each other. And the whole thing just sounds so naive about human nature that it's laughable.
Oh
And
yeah. Well, he didn't really live that far from town, did he?
I'm saying like no,
Yeah.
it's a walking distance of like I've been there. So I'm saying even so I guess I'm saying where, Cameron, have you actually seen that ideology work?
Well, no, I think you're misunderstanding though, because so Mill would not be in favor of what Thoreau's little hyper individualistic isolationist experiment. Thoreau is still, because keep in mind he's a liberal progressive, so he wants society organized on a mass scale to accommodate politically what he takes to be the ultimate good, which is self-creation.
Yes. Okay.
Does that make sense?
No. Well, yeah, it does. And thank you for the connection because I want to get back there. Is I'm saying is not that the concept that is impossible from a Christian anthropology? That you would be able to build a civilization of people who are all expressing their creativity, so to speak.
Okay, yes. So let's look at what's happening practically now with that. So ironically, and I promise we'll get back to Paul Kingsnorth. This is not taking us off subject at all. Actually, this is showcasing why politically our order is falling apart right now. So Paul Kingsnorth is giving a very, very much a theological and a spiritual read on this, but there is a political one as well, and that's what Patrick Deneen is doing. So John Stuart Mill thinks he is securing greater freedoms with his no harm principle. But look at how it's been put to use today. Basically, if anything causes me any kind of psychological harm, as or any sort of emotional distress, I immediately seek, action and protection, from administration, from different authorities. So increasingly, people are using this to kind of shut others up, essentially. So your views on sexuality, for instance, and sexual ethics as a religious person are actively harmful to me psychologically. See, that's the harm principle being pushed to such extreme heights now because we've all internalized it and it's being used. And so it's leading to greater and greater incoherence because there's no deep shared sense of common good or justice
so that's right.
to adjudicate these claims.
That's what I'm saying. The logical consequence of John Stuart Mill is either radical individualism,
which is almost solipsism. Yeah.
So I'm saying I think Thoreau was a manifestation of that because you can't do what Thoreau did in community. Like it doesn't make sense. You can't build a civilization on that kind of
right.
So I'm not saying I'm not saying what Thoreau did worked.
Yep.
I'm just saying
right.
Also the communal version of that kind of progress that Mills had also doesn't.
No, and it's not working.
Anywhere.
And so no, that's what's happening right now. So we're seeing the disintegration of our civilization, so this brings us back to Paul Kingsnorth. So now people are understandably what they see that Christianity is part of the heritage of the West, and it is. And they see, wow, it could function as real social glue, which it can up to a point. But that doesn't mean that we necessarily ought to push it in that direction, because I can already hear a lot of people. Well, I've actually had people say to me, well, why not? Why not simply use it and as social glue? And Paul Kingsnorth has some haunting imagery there where he talks about how true Christianity begins with the heart, and the heart controls the body. He talks about civilizational Christianity as the attempt to try to build the body first and then make your way somehow to the heart. And how it doesn't work. You're kind of reverse engineering Christianity by, well, we love the cathedrals and we love the rich cultural heritage from Christianity. This is Richard Dawkins. If there's one person we can pick on here, I don't think it's Jordan Peterson. I think he's I think stepping stones. I'm with you, Nathan. I think Ayaan Hirsi Ali is sincere. But I think the one person who we can pick on is Professor Richard Dawkins. He's explicitly making the claim that no, there's zero truth to Christianity, but I see immense cultural capital there now that I didn't before. So we need to push it forward.
But he would also say, but I only believe that because I was raised in a Christian-esque culture.
Right.
So even that is a pretty hollow.
It is completely. Oh yeah, it's as hollow as it gets. It's complete. The truth of it is completely immaterial to him, completely arbitrary.
And this is a preference he has.
Yes, because of upbringing. Yeah. So it's a completely pragmatic position. So the danger. Why is that bad? Why is the danger there? Well, the heart of true Christianity is justice is part of the heart of true Christianity, and compassion is part of the heart of true Christianity. But when you have Christian civilization devoid of that Christian heart, that's when you have the sword being used. That's when you have the conquest mindset. That's when you have idolatry taking place. That's when you have power corrupting. All of those things are kept in check by if you have a Christian conscience, if you have a Christian heart, those elements are that's what you're protected from.
So
if that's
can I give an example?
Yeah. Yes, please do.
So I was one of my kids was asking about the fall of Rome and like causes for the collapse of Rome, and I was like, oh goodness, because there are only like 5,000 theories of why. So I was like, showing this little
I bet
bedtime, yeah. The just for those of you who haven't been listening, my wife is a big fan of the comedian. I forget who it was who quipped that whenever it comes to bedtime, that his children turn into dehydrated philosophers who are afraid of the dark. So you're going to need a drink of water. You're going to have a big question. You're afraid of it. But no, so we were watching this little like YouTube video recap of the fall of Rome, and a lot of the paintings and images that are historically used to describe that have. So you have either the Romans or the barbarians with like the Christos star on their shield, or they're carrying a cross as a standard into battle. So they're like heads being lopped off, and there's blood everywhere, and half naked people. But you got the Christian symbols, etched into your shield, into the handle of your sword. And so it's that kind of thing where you look at that, and then you zoom out and you go over and you read what Jesus said. And then suddenly, and so I think that's why somebody coming in would struggle to say, if you've grown up with that acculturation of like, yeah, why not just put Christian imagery on your weapons? You're not going to think about it. But if you have somebody coming in kind of with a fresh perspective, it's like, wait a second, how do these two things actually fit together? There's a little recent example from our household.
Yeah. So we are in a position to think very seriously about these matters in a way that we haven't been in the past. So that's a convoluted way of saying that, yeah, this is a time of civilizational unrest. So it's just worth pointing out. I'm saying this more and more, that the Lord has us here, those of us who follow him, for such a time as this. You're not here on accident. Sometimes people, as it dawns on them, I'm living in interesting times. Living in interesting times. It's great to read about interesting times. Living through them is something else entirely. Many people are tempted to think, oh, why am I here right now? Why am I raising children in this world? Why, I'm just in the wrong time. I should have been somewhere else. I wish I wasn't here right now. It's an understandable attitude, but it's not the right one.
Nah.
This is a great time to be alive. This is an exciting time to be alive. These are the right questions to ask, but we need to remember the words of Scripture. I think often of the book of Acts when the apostles are getting ready to face all sorts of authorities, and they're they're the people who are, by the words of some of the church leaders, turning the world upside down. And they're told, don't be worried about what you're going to say, what you're going to do in those moments. The Holy Spirit will provide you
Well,
with everything that you need. Now, that's
okay,
assuming, of course, that you are in a vital relationship with the Lord, that you're in prayer, that you are reading His Word, and that you are worshiping on a routine basis with His people. But that said, you have all. The Lord will equip you. We all have all that we need, and you don't have to read Dominion by Tom Holland to be ready for this moment.
so give us some, as we bring this to a close here, Cameron, wrap up the conclusion of his argument, because I think somebody who hasn't, and it's a lengthy article, but
Yeah.
you could say, okay, are we in a moment where we're needing to separate out here? Um, okay, there's the response of we're going to go down fighting and swinging. Um, we're going to totally assimilate, or we're going to try to figure out a way to be part of it but maintain our distinctiveness. And it seems to me like there will be a necessary, and there is already a fracturing isn't the right word, but a developing tension between the styles of Christian engagement with the concept of the future, as it were. So one is maybe you want to circular wagons, join the Amish, build a bunker. I don't know. Um, yeah,
So
circle the
his
wagons.
yeah.
Or do you
Yep.
try to just say, oh, it's just there are ways in which we can hybridize this. There's a syncretistic pragmatic version of this. Or
Hmm.
do you say, I recognize that I need to live in the system, but I have to find ways to maintain my own distinctiveness and the uniqueness of my own culture in the midst of that.
Yeah.
Um, because
Yeah. So we
I think everybody who's hearing this is going to say, yeah, but it can't really be done. And
uh
then he pulls this card at the end, which is a good move on his part, where he says, just remember, Christianity is designed to kill you.
so you can be reborn.
Right. And so once you recognize that death is not the worst thing that can happen, suddenly some of these other questions and curiosities, like the kind of the tension is
Yeah.
released from the difficulty of what's being asked here.
Well, we have example. I mean, I'll give his example in a second, but we can also just look to the Bible and, of course, the Old Testament. Think about Babylonian exiles. I think a book and a person for our time is very much Daniel. There, we see it. We also have exhortations to seek the welfare of the city. That doesn't necessarily mean we're supporting everything that the city that we're in stands for. It means that we are about our king's business, working to make disciples of all people, and pouring and taking care of people, clothing the naked, and helping the sick, and visiting prisoners, and loving, practicing Christian love. So the figure he uses is a guy named Ohiesa, who was a Native American whose dad was sent to an internment camp, and then his dad came back wearing a suit and tie. He was part of the Sioux Indians, I believe, but he came back wearing a suit and tie and said, basically, "Hey, our world is over, so we need to be realistic, and we need to convert and essentially assimilate. But I expect you to do this, to pursue this path of assimilation in the same way that you would a war path. I expect for you to conquer." But that's not exactly what Ohiesa did. He did become a Christian, but he too believed that it was very important for him to hold on to his heritage as a Native American, and to that he believed that his heritage had very important things to say still to the America that was being remade, reshaped, or imposed, you might say. So, in a sense, Paul
But
Kingsnorth's conclusion is, yeah,
but for that, how do you pronounce his name? Not Odisa.
Ohiesa.
Oh, Hiesa. He saw a deeper compatibility between Christianity and his native culture than he did between
Yes,
Christianity and
right.
American culture.
Yep.
And so that's a key part of this article that you don't want to miss if you're thinking through this.
Yes. Well, and why? Because his his Native American culture was not predicated on conquest and civilization. Again, let's go back to our handy, ugly little definition, society organized on a mass scale. That's not the way Native American tribes were organized at all, and wasn't built on acquisitiveness. I mean, again, it's a very rich article. There's another really important section of the article where he makes a masterful case that our entire civilization now is predicated on the 7 deadly sins. Pride being at the very forefront of it. We even have an entire month devoted to pride. But not only that, lust is a huge part of the advertising industry. Sloth. He talks about the paradoxical phrase of the leisure industry.
Yeah.
Envy, acquisitiveness. Well, the whole liberal order is built on that.
Yeah.
Avarice and greed. He said if we weren't all greedy, the economy would come to a standstill. If we were not greedy for a day, the economy would collapse. He's totally right. So the whole social order is built on some of the what have been recognized down the ages by Christians as the deadliest of vices, the most spiritually dangerous habits of the soul. Our whole civilization is built on that. So his conclusion is that no, we don't need Christian civilization. We need Christian men and women. His conclusion is the same thing that we tell you every week on Thinking Out Loud, basically. We need the church to be the church, Christians to be Christians. Worship the Lord in spirit and truth. Follow Jesus's commands to the best of your abilities. Be a good citizen. Don't be a complete anarchist or firebrand. Paul says much the same thing in Romans 13. But we are to seek ultimately God's glory, and that will make the bigger difference in the end. That's the truth. He also has a really good point to make that we've been saying more and more that we're in it for the long game as Christians. Christian hope is predicated on the long game rather than short-term solutions. So in that sense, he talks about the monks who gave us a longer, more stable, durable culture than any of these other kind of martial expeditions did. And he's right. So much of what they were doing was conserving what was precious and protecting, but not with swords. And that's a hard sell nowadays. But yeah, his argument is basically, hey, Christian, be a Christian in the full sense of the word, in the sense of being Jesus's disciple, and the rest will take care of itself. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going to be, smiles and rainbows for you in your daily circumstances. But ultimately, your life is in God's hands, and your ultimate well-being is secure. The problem is we have to, it's an article of faith to believe that. And we have to work on that. Again, that's why we are worshiping. That's what helps us to firm up that belief.
Cameron, just one final thing here. And I think we sufficiently muddied the water and irritated or piqued the interest of enough people to go and
it's
read
all
this
Paul
article.
Kingsnorth's fault. We'll just blame him.
Blame him. But you often use the line to discern is to say this, not this. And what strikes me as you're bringing all these ideas here to the end is that discernment is what's required there. But then when you brought in worship is the time in which we're developing a sense of this.
Yes.
Like
yes.
So you can't exclusively focus on the not this as a Christian in our culture and be like, well, that's bad and that's bad and that's bad and that's wrong and that's broken and that's weird and that's sideways. And like, you have to have the this, not this, in order to Christian well, or be Christ-like. And so worship really is that the focus on what is the real this that we're comparing all the not thises to. And because I think if you don't have that balance, you just end up bitter and scared. If you have a broader vision of what is supposed to be and what is really stable, what is truly hopeful, where your energy can be spent, that all, I was at a church recently and the pastor, I was there for a couple services, and at the end of it, he prayed a great prayer for me that I really like and stuck with me. He said, Lord, as Nathan goes out, would you remind him that the most powerful way in which he can change the world is to learn to be like Jesus?
Yep.
It's like, yep, amen. I will take that. And so there you have it. Thanks, Dave.
That's the argument of the article too. That's the conclusion. Hard to disagree. Well, yes, it's been trenchant, as it sometimes is. It's been a little lengthier, so thank you for indulging us there. I have a feeling we'll have a bit of a mail day after this one. So we look forward to your responses. Also, remember, you can, if you're not on TOL Connect, or if you are on TOL Connect is the place to continue the conversation and or the discussion and keep working through some of these items and set us straight. Would love to see you there. But thank you for sticking with us. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.